guess Rochester in the 83 says this too, but it hurt more because it was Dame Judi Dench that he was talking about in this version. When he calls Jane to like talk to him, he's like, I can't talk to children or simple old ladies. And it cuts to Dame Judi Dench's face and she's like, well, that went a bit far. And it was just like, yeah, ouch, she's nice. And she's probably related to you.
Honestly, she's so much better than you. Michael Fassbender can't do anything. Don't even breathe the same air as our Dame.
You are not worthy. Well, hey, Lillian, welcome back. What's going on?
Thanks for welcoming me back. I'm so excited. I just watched another version of Jane Eyre.
Oh my gosh, this is the second version you've seen. What did you think? Any initial reactions?
I have so many thoughts, but I actually really want to know what you think first, because I have very strong feelings that are not going to change. And I'm very curious as to what you think about this one.
Okay, yeah. I would say, so my first thing about this is that, so it's Michael Fassbender, right? As our Mr. Rochester. For me personally, I don't find him nearly as attractive as a 1980s Timothy Dalton. I've always seen Michael Fassbender as kind of like a shark man. Like when he opens his mouth really wide, he's got so many teeth. So I was wondering, I was like, I wonder how Lillian will rate the attractive scale of this Rochester compared to all the others we will see. So for me, I mean, I like his voice and his presence, and that's all really sexy. I personally don't find him visually super hot, especially the way that we see him at the end of the film, which we will talk about. But so for casting, I thought performance-wise, very good. Appearance-wise, technically very good, because for me, I don't find him attractive and he's not supposed to be hot. So they got that one. They aced that. I would say initial reactions about, like, at least comparing to the previous version that we've seen is, for me, it's felt very art housey. The cinematography is immensely better. I mean, it's several decades after, like, when the previous one that we watched was made. So they're going for they have a higher budget. They have a better aesthetic. I thought a lot of the characters were more likable. Some characters less likable, but we can discuss later. But these are some of my initial things. So I thought it was very pretty, very well acted. I'm not sure if I like it personally better than the parts that I love about the 1983 version. So these are just some of my initial musings. What about you? Tell me the things that you refuse to change.
So here's the reason I wanted your initial reaction first. I absolutely loved this version.
Yay!
And first, the caveat on it before I go into all the reasons I loved it, I don't know if it's because I know the story now, so it was less jarring to watch these people do these things that felt insane to me. Right. But I felt like this corrected for all the things that I found really annoying in the last one. I actively disagree and think Michael Fassbender is super hot. Not that Timothy is not. He just doesn't float my boat quite as much as he floats yours.
Which is okay. Everyone has a Mr. Rochester out there that's made just for them.
Yeah. And I have super specific things that I want to talk through with all this stuff, but I found every character more sympathetic or more likable. At the very least, with the past version, the 83 version that we watched, I felt like there were so many character moments where I'm like, what are you doing? Like, why do you think this is a good idea? And I never found myself asking that with this one. Like, all the character moments, even the ones that I was like, oh, I see this now. Like, I can see the emotion here in a way that makes me care about it more. Now, again, to talk about the most important thing, and apparently the only thing we care about in the high level synopsis is the Mr. Rochester. I will say, as a person, I tend to be more attracted to personalities than physique.
Yeah.
Or like face.
Yeah.
Or
which is good and important.
Shark teeth.
Shark teeth. They did not scare her away. She's like, chow
I wasn't scared. Yeah. But I just found this Rochester, like, so much more sympathetic. I found the chemistry between Jane and Rochester so much better in this than I wouldn't have named the chemistry between Jane and Rochester as a problem in the 83 because I had so many other problems with the 83. But comparing it to the chemistry here, I believe these two are in love in a way that I didn't believe it in the 83.
No, I totally see what you're saying. I felt in watching this one, because this is my second time watching this version, that what stood out to me, I think Jane's personality and her wit, the way that she matches his wit and challenges him, is done so much better in this version than it was in the 83 one. And so, I agree. That's, I think, where a lot of that chemistry came from, is her sitting there and kind of making these kind of snide remarks. I mean, she's, like we said, she's reading the same lines, but she's doing it with a bit of confidence and sass that we didn't see before. And so therefore it's like, oh, this is like flirting. You guys are both into it. It's cool.
Yeah. And I think like one of the big things is I think the way we talked about this with the 83 version about how it's like a very faithful adaptation, but it's more, I almost want to say it's more direct. Like, the way, I talked, a lot of my criticisms were around like the way people said things that seemed really bizarre, or they spent a really long time watching people walk across a room and things like that, where I think this takes advantage of the medium to tell the same story, but with the advantages of like the moments of quiet aren't about the characters walking across the room or like establishing a new space or anything like that. They're about giving, like there's a moment where after the fire, when Jane is going back to her room, she stands at the door and we see her like taking off her nightgown, getting ready to go back into her bed. And she's just like, you can tell that she's thinking about him. So it's a moment of quiet that films deserve, but it's building this character of like, oh, I can now see that Jane has a crush on him.
Yes.
She's got the hots for her boss.
What's a girl to do?
So they do a lot of that stuff where like, instead of it being a voiceover where we're like, I don't know, like, I guess like, then I found Mr. Rochester and he was like, it's a lot more show don't tell kind of stuff. Yeah. And I think the order that they tell the story, they switch up the order a little bit, which I think is the biggest in terms of like plot flow. Where in the 83, they tell it like she starts as a child and it goes through, she becomes an adult, all that stuff.
Yeah.
This, they start with her leaving. And we know that because we know the story, but if you didn't know it. So here's a context of my watching experience. I watched with my mom.
Oh, cute.
So my mom was visiting me today. And so I made her watch with me.
Very nice.
And I asked her if she wanted to watch this and she goes, do you think I would like it? And I was like, I don't. Which really sold her on it. But I ended up, so I think lowering her expectations coming in maybe helped a little bit. She didn't know what was happening. So there was lots of times where like I was looking over at her being like, what's going on? So the time jumps of it starts with her leaving and then she finds who we know are her cousins, but they actually don't make them her cousins in this.
I know there's some interesting choices of changes that they make in this for the plot and everything. And I think that was part of this writer's adaptation is they were like, that's like maybe a little too, oh, what luck. Like you've wandered through the moors after this horrible disaster and you just fall at the doorstep of your family that you didn't know you had.
I had so much more sympathy for this Jane, like even leaving, like I had so much more sympathy for her because it starts with her, like 83 Jane. I realized I had no sympathy for her when she was a vagrant because she just does a series of really stupid things.
Yes.
It's the comparison of like, she decides to leave. She packs up a bag. She goes and takes this carriage that she gives them all of her money. Then she leaves her stuff. She gets off in the middle of nowhere, knowing that it's the middle of nowhere. And then she sleeps in the moors. And I'm like, I just like, don't care. You seem so dumb. Where this one, she ends up in the same situation, but how she gets there, it's like, she's so distraught. She doesn't really know what she's doing.
Yeah.
And she has a bag, but it's like sort of bizarre. And she climbs out a window and the crying on a rock makes more sense to me than laying down to go to sleep on some moss. Like,
well, we see that in this movie too. There is in one of the flashback of her on the moor scenes, we do see her taking the little moss nap. So
Yes.
that's still there.
Super critical. So that's where this movie starts. And then it cuts back to her childhood, which we talked a lot about how they spend too much time in the childhood previously. The moments are so much, each individual moment is so much more emotional and it's much more condensed.
Oh, yes.
So they give us, I think it tells the story of her childhood trauma in a way that actually feels more realistic to me, where it's like, if somebody's telling you how scarring their trauma, like how they're scarring their childhood was, they don't go, well, I was born in 1840. And
let me tell you the long version.
Let me tell you about the exact uniforms that we wore and how we walked in these lines and there were these bells. Let me tell you about the bells.
Well, so Lillian, I think that leads into a really good point of a scene of dialogue that we get between Jane and Rochester that we didn't see in the 1983 version. You know, when he's asking her, he's like, because she's a governess, and he's like, tell me your tragic tale, your tale of woe, I think he says. And she says, I don't have a tale of woe, because Jane is this kind of person who's like, I've seen actual suffering, and though I myself have suffered, it is not my place to say that my life is sad compared to other people, like my friend Helen, who got sick and died. And so I think that kind of plays into that too there, where they do a nice job of giving us a brief summary, a brief look into her childhood and her sadness. But it's the same thing of when she's sitting in that chair and she says, I had an aunt. She hated me. She sent me away. They disciplined me in this school, but I got an education. That's all you need to know. Yeah, it sucked, I guess, but I'm here and I'm still living and now I have a decent life. Let's move on. So I like that kind of parallel.
It's the show don't tell thing, right? Like instead of it being every time somebody in the 83 version was like, Jane, you're so intense. I was like, is she that intense? We're like, this Jane, she's obviously polite and she lives within the society and she respects that. But like the example for me that was the real difference was when she's looking out that window and Mrs. Fairfax comes in right before we meet Rochester. She's looking out a window to this beautiful landscape. Miss Fairfax comes in and like asks why she seems sad and like, doesn't she have a good life here and all that stuff? And she gives this little speech about how men can go out and see the world and her world is limited to the horizon. And I'm like, that is the Jane Eyre that everyone else was telling me about. And just like the way that she talks about sort of everything and the way that she talks back to Mr. Rochester, where she talks to him like he's an equal.
Yeah.
In a way that like Mr. Rochester told us she was talking to him like he was an equal in the last one. Where this one, I really see that.
Right. I think that is probably a product of it being a more recently made film. I think, you know, the more we make this movie, the more progressive the adaptations probably will become. I would be very curious, obviously, when you and I are old ladies still doing this podcast, to see like what is the cybernetic, futuristic take on Jane Eyre.
Yes.
And how does that story continue to evolve?
Based on the frequency of the adaptations of Jane Eyre, we're due for another one. I do have a little bit of dialogue written down from when she does meet. So from that same conversation you're talking about right after she does meet Mr. Rochester, that I think is one of my favorite points in it. And I think it's a similar dialogue to what we saw previously, but I also think kind of talks about that same difference in the way that they have chemistry in this. And it's such a subtle shift. He's talking to her, they're sitting down, he's saying the same things. Like he says that he's going to draw her out, right? Which is something that I really mocked in the last one. And he says, were you waiting for your people with her? Why was she out in the woods? And she's sort of confused and like asked him what he means by that. And he says, imps and elves and little green men. And she said, they're all gone because this immediately like back with him bantering, no hesitation, no discomfort, just like meeting him at that same level of intensity. And the looks on both of their faces is like, oh, this is a fun game. And I like this.
Totally. And I'm just like impressed with her ability to have that kind of immediate back and forth reaction, because when she's at that window scene talking to Mrs. Fairfax, I think that's when she says, I've never seen a city, I've never spoken to a man, and all these other things. And so if I've never talked to a guy in my entire life and my first like real conversation with him, I'm doing toe to toe witty banter with this dude, give me a gold star, please. I can't even do that now most times.
Yeah.
So very
sure.
impressive for Jane. Well done. So I like that we've addressed one of the major narrative changes of them starting us kind of in the middle and kind of flashing back and forth between her sadness at the end of the story and her sadness at the beginning of the story. And then there's a big chunk in the middle where we just see her living her life at Thornfield and going through that until we go back once again to the kind of timeline of the plot. A few other major things that stood out to me that I think are important to address. So I said this in our first episode, I believe, because the 1983 version, even though they decided to spend several episodes in her sad school and childhood, they did not show us the death scene with Helen, which I think is pretty important. And one thing that really stood out to me about that scene, so that is in this version. And when Jane is laying in bed with her dying friend, one of the only people we've seen thus far to ever show her compassion or kindness, her friend says to her, she's like, you know, are you afraid to die? And she says no, because she's very faithful. She's like, I'm going to go on to heaven. That's where my father is. It's going to be great. But she's still like kind of scared. And she's like, don't leave me. Stay here with me. And Jane makes the statement. She's like, I will not leave you. I'm going to be here with you. And the note that I wrote down about that, about why this scene is important, is I think because Jane devotes herself to anyone who offers her companionship, because it's something that she hasn't received before, which I think is good to show us as an audience for when we are introduced to Rochester and him being, yes, still a dickbag, but at least he is kind of having this like slightly even playing field. He's bantering with her. He's like, oh yeah, we're equals. He gives her that. And so now we already have seen previous examples of Jane saying, okay, someone wants to respect me in some way or be my equal, be my companion, I'm sticking with you. And we have that scene here too, where he kind of questions her on that when the brother-in-law arrives from Jamaica. And he says, before he's even met with him, he says to Jane, if everyone in that room, because he has this party over all these guests, he's like, if they were all to like leave and scorn me, would you leave with them? And she says, no, sir, I would stay with you. And he's shocked by that. So it's like her devotion and also him needing someone to like stay by his side no matter what. I thought that was done very well.
On an equally sincere note, I think we did miss a really kind of critical character building moment where we start to understand Rochester more as someone who's crazy and wants to gaslight everyone, which is he never dressed up as a gypsy.
I know they took that one out. Lillian, most modern versions that I've seen so far, they remove that scene because they're like, ooh, maybe not have done this.
This is problematic for a myriad of reasons.
Yes. So there was none of that. There was no very long charades game. The other thing this movie removed that I thought was really interesting was there's no like red herring of Grace Poole until like the very end. He only says her name right when he's taking his bride up to the tower to show them the truth. We don't have Jane thinking that Grace Poole is the one who's doing all these wacky things. Instead, there's this story that Adele tells about this weird woman who walks the halls at night, can fade through walls and drinks people's blood. So it's kind of switches this ghost and madwoman thing with this kind of a vampire idea, which I really liked because when she then attacks her brother, he's bit in the throat. And that plays really well into this idea that there's a vampire hiding away in this house. And I liked that change.
I also think that just in general, they do the kind of scary creepiness in a much more subtle way. It's like the laughter sounds quiet enough that it could be the wind, right? Like it's not clearly a woman laughing. And like the creepier moments, again, like I don't know what I would have thought of that if I didn't know the story going in. And it's not even clear why the fire starts. Where in the 83 version, do we see her run out of the room? Am I remembering that correctly?
We don't see her run out of the room. Jane goes into the hallway and there are candles that are in the hall on the floor. One is tipped over. And I think right when she comes out, the door to the tower slams shut. So, yeah.
So we get this evidence that like there was something happening where like this, we have no idea where this came from. We don't know what's going on. He runs off, but in a way that feels more legitimate to me. Where like in the 83, she's like upset and he just kind of pulls at her and leaves. We're like in this one, and it's such a subtle moment, but like he puts a jacket or a blanket or something around her and then he leaves. And it's like there's something a little bit softer about that I enjoy.
I also enjoyed that tender moment, but I have to correct you. Timothy Dalton also was a gentleman and wrapped his coat around that itty bitty lady before he left.
This is just my bias against your poor sweet Timothy, who deserves all of our respect and love.
Since we're on the flaming bed scene, I was so shocked to see, like, there's a part where so first of all, I felt like he was very chill at first when he was getting up. He was like, whatever, my bed's on fire, doesn't matter. But then when he was like actually jumping around, we get like such a flash of like his bare thighs, and it's like very clear that he's like, I'm like, dude, he's wearing a shirt and nothing else. And then there's that scene, where he literally just like, he pulls on his pants and Jane turns around like, oh my God, like I'm not only in a bedroom with my boss, but he's not wearing any pants and there's no undies. And it's just like, oh my gosh, this is a whole different level of vulnerability between the two of them.
And the way he holds her hand when he comes back.
Mm.
Ooh. And the like closeness of the like, are they gonna kiss? Oh my God, are they gonna kiss? And I know they're not going to, but are they?
That one was done. It's a different level of sexy for me. So like this current one that we just watched, the 2011, it's like their faces are getting slowly closer and closer. They're both doing the thing where they're looking at each other's mouths. You know, they're like, ooh, that kiss, it's going to happen. It's super duper sexy on its own. And then she obviously leaves and has that cute little moment against the door in her bedroom. She's like, ooh, butterflies. But in the 80s version too, it doesn't do like an almost kiss, but there is still that tension. It's just a different kind of tension. Although what I will say, I think to your side's credit, it's a little less romantic, that she does generally just seem kind of scared and uncomfortable and not like she's into it. Where this movie makes it seem like she's like, oh dude, she wants that kiss. Like she definitely wants to stay, but she can't because she might get fired.
I think there's a layer of like move forward in filmmaking, like you were sort of saying in the point that you had before. But I think the part that I also think is a factor of the adaptation is if this was a book, we would be hearing in Jane's head that she finds him hot, right?
Right.
And I think there's just the pure adaptation. She's maybe acting the way she would have acted in the book, but we don't get to see what's happening in her head. Where this, they make it more external. Because it's a movie.
Right, exactly. So, Lillian, I'm curious. I'd like to know how some of the other characters struck you. Because I feel the one that really stood out to me as being an extreme improvement was Dame Judi Dench's Mrs. Fairfax.
Oh my God, yes.
Yes. No, such a sweet lady right from the start. And the fact that, because you said this in our second episode about how you're like, Jane, she didn't have to go off and be an idiot. She could have like stayed and done stuff. And I love that in this one, Mrs. Fairfax says that to her when she goes back to the burnt ruins of Thornfield. She's like, I would have helped you. So I love that.
Every part of Mrs. Fairfax, like before I go into it, the cast of this is spectacular.
So good.
So every actor that we're going to talk about as these like more minor characters, so good.
Yes.
Dame Judi Dench.
The queen.
So good. Amazing. I could go on about just the concept of Judi Dench being in this, but I won't. The way that she's so much like immediately when I saw the 83 version, my first vibes of her were like, I'd been so burned by every other person in Jane's life that I just wasn't willing to trust anymore. And so I didn't like her. And even throughout the thing, she sort of seemed like really hoity-toity and like very much representative of the rest of society and like just didn't really like her. Where immediately Miss Dench, Dame, the Dame, the Dame,
one, the only,
is just immediately so much better. Like I just immediately feel comfortable with Jane being there. She seems so much more welcoming. She like even the way that she describes the servants feels less, it's still condescending, but it feels less condescending. And the way that she introduces her, like the way she talks about what room she gave her is very much like, listen, they're a little fancier on this side of the house, but I find the other ones more comfortable. I hope you're okay with that. That's why I gave you this one. Even the speech that she gives to Jane about being careful with Mr. Rochester, it feels less like you probably shouldn't be dating your boss and more like, honey, I'm so worried you're going to get your heart broken.
Right.
And even my mom, who's sitting next to me watching this, it's the first time she says something out loud about a character in the movie, goes, those are all super fair points.
Oh,
I was like, oh.
did you by any chance happen to ask your mother her kind of reaction to this that you could share? Like, what's this kind of third person?
Broad strokes, she really liked it.
Yay.
And she thought I was crazy for not liking Jane Eyre. And I was like, I'm going to make you watch the 83 version. And you tell me after 6 hours of that what you think.
I agree that the dame, like sort of what you touched on, she really steps in for Jane there of being this mother figure where Jane hasn't really had that person to give her advice, especially on men, but on anything to say, hey, because we assume that Mrs. Fairfax was married, and I believe her husband died. And so now she's a widow. So at least she has some experience with men and has also, by being the housekeeper here at Thornfield, she has some experience just watching the society and everything and just having that insight. But yes, her trying to look out for Jane is nice.
I think that leads really well into another character that while I don't like them more in this, I think is the character feels more real and more sympathetic rather than cartoonishly villain-esque, is her aunt in this one.
I love that actress.
I can't remember her name. I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, look it up.
While I'm doing that, I've established real strong opinions about everything in this movie. So I want to know what your thoughts are on her aunt.
So when it comes to her aunt, I like this portrayal way better than the 83 version, but I love this actress. I liked how elegant she was. I thought those scenes where she's sitting there in that drawing room, with her perfect hair and her perfect dress. And it really stuck out to me. She struck me with this performance as a woman who has a lot of insecurities and who is very afraid of what people think of her. And so I think when she tells Brocklehurst that Jane is deceitful, she thinks to herself, I got her. Like, zing. That's the worst thing anyone could say about anybody. Gotcha. And then Jane turns it right back on her and she's like, I'm not deceitful. You're the one who's deceitful. I'm going to tell everybody you're a bad person. And it just strikes her in the heart. And she's like, get out of here. Because that's her own vulnerability and her own weakness. So I thought that was really good.
So it's Sally Hawkins is the name of the actress.
From Paddington Bear and also The Shape of Water.
Yes. And I think I completely agree with what you're saying about she seems really insecure, but I think there's subtle differences in the way they play these moments that makes her so much more sympathetic. So obviously you don't agree with the way she's treating a child, but the way that they start her childhood is with her terrible cousin, who seems much more menacing in this because he's coming at her with a sword and then he hits her into the wall with a book.
Yes.
And that moment, so that moment is more intense, but no adults see that. What they see is Jane's very intense reaction back. And suddenly that makes all the adults so much more sympathetic because Jane is this crazy wild thing. That's the way that she acts. And so then you don't go, okay, I'm sorry. This kid was bullying her. She kind of freaked out. And then you put her in a torture room. Right. It's no, she was beating the shit out of this guy. Yes. She was she had him on the ground and she was hitting him. And he was a lot bigger than her, but she still managed to do that. And she does seem sort of crazy. So the reaction of you need to get her out of here. And then the overreaction of that is where she loses. There's an understanding as to why she would do that, but she loses our sympathy.
Right.
And then when she's sending her away, the way that she talks about her seems so much more sane versus the cartoonish villainy of the way that the other character talked about her. And the moment of talking about her as deceitful. And after the horrible preacher man leaves the room, the way that Jane gives that speech feels scary.
Yeah, it's intimidating.
I was intimidated by her. And it made her reaction to that speech make more sense.
Right. No, I totally agree.
And every moment that she's on screen, I don't agree with the way this adult is treating a child, but I understand it in a way that I couldn't grasp with the other ones.
Right. No, I totally agree. You also touched on something that I kind of stood out to me that I didn't really pick up on before from the 83 version. So they walk into the room, the adults walk into the room and they just see Jane wailing on this boy and like beating him up. And he's like crying for help and all this stuff. And even today, people will be like, whoa, geez, like calm down. But like back then, especially she's acting out and they're viewing her as being crazy essentially. And I think that draws a parallel that I hadn't picked up on before between her and Bertha, where young Jane acts out and is crazy, quote unquote, and they lock her in a room. Bertha acts out and is, we assume, certifiably crazy, and they lock her in a room. And it's just very interesting to kind of see that, where Jane later, when she learns the truth, she could have that sympathy for Bertha to be like, I too have been, quote unquote, savage, but like the world deserved it, you know, like, I'm sorry, you're locked away here. So although that's one thing that this movie didn't do, they didn't really have Jane's side of that speech where she says, I do not hate her because she is mad. Where I think the other version does have a little bit more of Jane being like, how could you do this to this lady? I feel like she does kind of express a bit more sympathy for Bertha's situation.
Yeah. So I do want to, I think that leads really well into talking about Bertha and the whole way that situation plays out in this, because, well, I think that Bertha doesn't like, while Jane doesn't express as much sympathy for Bertha, Rochester doesn't express as much venom for her. And I think the way that he tells the story makes me so much more sympathetic for him than I ever was our sweet Timmy D. So there's the moment of like when they go up into the attic. I think they did her crazy aesthetic very similar, but the actress is very clearly gorgeous, which I think gives that very subtle hint to the character of like who she was when she sort of seduced Rochester. Like you can see that gorgeous woman under there. You can see how she kind of seems really fine and calm at first, and then she scratches his neck and has this like moment of a break. And you're hearing other people talk about her in the background while we're experiencing Jane's sort of dissociative moment of like, oh my God, of like everything's kind of breaking down around her. And
I really, if I can interrupt real quick, I really liked that because everything kind of becomes, the sound is changed in this movie, in that scene where it almost feels as if she's underwater, or everything is kind of echoey because she's in this moment of shock. But the things that you hear them saying about Bertha, that they can't have furniture in the room because she can fashion anything into a weapon, and they've had to bar up the windows because she's taken to thinking that she can fly and like jump out and do these crazy things. It's so interesting to hear these little details fed to her, and she kind of hears them, but she's also so dazed by just this truth that's been thrust upon her.
Yep. And it doesn't feel like they're sort of dismissing her as like, that bitch crazy. They're more like it talks about this step-by-step process of how they got to this being the solution. And I think so the critical moment for me is when the conversation that Jane has with Rochester afterwards, which I think you mentioned, like that's a live or die for Rochester moment.
Yes.
I didn't really find Timmy D's speech that sympathetic until he starts so angry.
Right.
And then he switches to sad. And I think this Rochester with Michael Fassbender, he starts sad. Like there's high emotion, but the emotion is not anger. It's pain and sadness. And he talks about, I have it written down, the exact wording that he says at one point, where he says, have you ever been to a madhouse?
Yes.
Like, this is better than that, which to me, the way that he talks about it is like, I know this isn't okay. I know this isn't a fair option for her. I lived with that for 4 years and it just got worse and worse.
Yeah.
There's no other option right now. The other option is a madhouse. I went and looked at that and I can't send her there.
Yeah.
And it makes me heartbreak for him in a way that it's so sad.
Oh, totally. No, I'm glad that touched you, because that's, like, I think every version that we watch, it's that scene that tells me personally, okay, is this a Rochester I can be sympathetic for, or is this a Rochester who I do not like? It all depends on, how they do that scene. Yeah, that was intense. Although, so you talked about him going from starting with sadness. I think it's important to emphasize that Fassbender's Rochester in that scene goes from sadness to almost violence and like anger. Because what the 83 version left out, which is part of the novel, is when he like has his hands on Jane's throat and he says that line where he's like, I could break you or bend you with my like thumb and forefinger or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this kind of moment where he kind of loses it for a second. And it's like, I could force you to stay. And I think it's also supposed to be this kind of read. And it's like, you know, if he gave in to his demons, he might rape her. Like, who knows what would happen? Like, he's like, you could stay here and be with me. And that would be, you can't say anything about it. But then he like falls to his knees. And I really loved, okay, do you happen to know what's the actress who plays Jane in this? Do you know her name?
I will look up. Continue.
Okay. Whatever her name is, she did that scene. I thought she did fabulous. I love when he's there on his knees and he's clinging to her dress and you can see her hands like hovering and they're kind of shaking as if she's like, I don't want to touch you. Cause I think in the way I read into it, she's like, if I touch you, I'm going to give in to all of these feelings. And she says, I think something along the lines of like, God help me. And then she shoves him away and then she leaves. But I loved that body language and that acting from her. I thought that was really good.
Yeah. And I think, I can't pronounce her last name, which is terrible, but it's Mia W.
Mia W.
So I think I see that. And I also think, while I think the sadness and pain into the anger and then back to the sadness, I think is what makes me more sympathetic to the anger. Like the anger is more acceptable to me when it's the second reaction. And I think, because you and I have talked about this a lot, something that maybe in life would be a little too intense for me, but in a romance I enjoy is that passion and intensity. And you can see that passion and intensity in their relationship in that moment. And I also think that it lends more sympathy to the way that he treats Bertha even, because he knows that he could do this. He could throw Jane in an attic, right? And tell everyone, and he has enough power in this society that he could just tell everyone that Jane went crazy and no one would stop him from doing that, right? So not only could he keep her, but he could keep her with no consequences for himself because he's got a woman in his attic, but he's not, that moment is, I could do this, but I'm not going to because it's wrong. And that makes his other actions that are so easy to paint with a broad brush and now would be like so deeply unacceptable, but was the only good option given the context, so much more sympathetic.
I really like that point. And I think we see both characters experiencing that kind of thought process in that moment because he's here and he's like, I could keep you and I could force you here. But Jane also has this kind of temptation and she's like, I could stay. But she decides, no, I'm going to go. And he decides, I'm going to let you leave. At least kind of. He thinks, I think just then she's leaving the room. Because obviously the next morning when she sneaks out in the night and he does a whole beast howling from his castle as he goes to the window and screams her name. Ooh, by the way, one thing that I personally love that this movie did that I haven't seen in any other adaptation, but I love when Jane is in her schoolhouse, like at the end of the film, and it's a snowy night and she hears that banging on the door.
Oh, yes.
She has that momentary fantasy where she opens it and it's him and he comes in and they just start kissing and they're like, but then it like snaps to reality and oops, it's St. John. Which she does not kiss, but she's just fantasizing that Rochester would come looking for her. And I loved that. I loved that it gave us that moment.
Well, we've talked about all the things that we like. And I think surely out of equality, I need to talk about the moments that were still buck wild in this.
Tell me your buck wild stuff.
So I think a most important lesson that we've learned from both adaptation of Jane Eyre, and I'm going to keep an eye out for this in every adaptation because I think it's super important. And it's hot milk saves lives. Because the first thing they do every time Jane is sick, and specifically when she's definitely not a vagrant, but is passed out on their doorstep, is quickly get her some hot milk. Hot milk. She is ill. We will solve it with hot milk. And it works.
She perks right up.
So I don't know why we need doctors. Like hospitals are really expensive and we should all just drink hot milk.
I think we just need to make like name tags or like necklaces that you wear. It's like when you have like a diabetic bracelet and it's like, call this number, just like wear a bracelet. And when someone's like, oh no, they've passed out. You look at the bracelet, it says administer hot milk. And you're like, oh, cool. That's what she needs. Yeah.
Email us if you would like some hot milk merch. Then there's another cool thing where they immediately accuse her of being a vagrant. And then he says she's not a vagrant. And that's a cool thing because I like when somebody's dying, they should at least be rich. When they're cutting back and forth between her childhood and that moment, and her being with the family, and when the first time she goes downstairs with the definitely not her cousins, a really cool thing to say to someone the first time that you meet them is, "I thought we'd be escorting you to an unmarked grave." That's like a fun bantery thing. Like, you don't know somebody, they were really sick, but the hot milk saved them. And they've like come out of their room for the first time with a bunch of strangers. A way to immediately make them feel comfortable and welcome is to say, with what seems like a lot of seriousness, but then at the very end gets a little smile, "I thought we'd be escorting you to an unmarked grave."
Well, I think in a world with as few access to medicine as they have and doctors, you just kind of start to embrace mortality and be like, this lady could have died. Whatever happens all the time. But
we wouldn't have known what to do with her body, so we would have just thrown her in a hole.
Yeah, because we didn't really know your name.
So as her childhood, again, like all the adults, super cool. Like they say, this is the pedestal of infamy, which I would like.
Down too.
I would like one of those for my house. I want a pedestal of infamy, and that way, when I have guests over, if I don't like any of them, because you and I are both homeowners now, fairly recent for both of us.
Yes.
And as homeowners, we have to learn new things, like you need to know whether or not your basement has radon. You need to have a pedestal of infamy. Those kind of things that you learn.
When you're just over someone, you're like, okay, go to the pedestal, stand there. Nobody talk to her. She's a deceitful person.
This is no shade to Dame Judi Dench, who, if she said this about me, that would be 100% acceptable to me. Although the character she's playing, Mrs. Fairfax, it's a bit harsh. When talking about the servants, she says the same line she says in the other movie, which is, "One cannot talk to them on equal terms."
There is always prevalent this issue of class, I think, in this. Because I think part of the reason why when she's brought into the house of St. John and his sisters, when they bring up, they're like, "Oh, is she a vagrant?" I think they're all trying to suss out. They're like, is this someone that we can treat as an equal? Is this someone who's below us? It's just something that's prevalent in everybody's mind in this time, it seems. So yeah. What can you do? I felt bad for the Dame Jude when in this one, I guess Rochester in the 83 says this too, but it hurt more because it was Dame Judi Dench that he was talking about in this version. When he calls Jane to like talk to him, he's like, "I can't talk to children or simple old ladies." And it cuts to Dame Judi Dench's face and she's like, "Well, that went a bit far." And it was just like, yeah, ouch. She's nice. And she's probably related to you.
Honestly, she's so much better than you. Michael Fassbender can't do anything. Don't even breathe the same air as our Dame.
You are not worthy.
And once again, I think that this version is so much sweeter, so much nicer. But also just kind of a parallel of the way that Jane was taught as kind of treated and taught as a child versus how little French girl is treated and taught as a child.
Adele,
thank you. The moment where like they're meeting and stuff, the Dame is so nice and sweet about her, like much more curious in a like adult wondering about a child way, and not in a what an odd thing to be in this house way. But the moment that kills me is this little French girl. They give her so long to, with no music, sing her song and dance around. And then the three adults in the room, instead of doing what you would for sure do if a little kid just sang, which is like applaud and be like, "Great job, you did an attempt." They're all dead silent. Not even Jane smiles. None of them react until after a few beats, the Dame goes, "How very French."
So I agree with you that's like, it's like, ooh, savage. But so I think what I read into that, because especially what we learn from the way Rochester talks about Adele's mother, and Adele said before she does her little song, she's like, "Oh yes, I would come and I would sit on men's laps who came to see my mother." I know, creepy, very creepy. And then she sings this song and she's with her little dance moves. I feel as if their stunned silence kind of says to them, "Whoa, you should not have been dancing and singing like this in front of grown men who are coming to probably pay your mother for sex." Like, I think that's where the stunned silence comes from. So I understand that that's kind of setting in for them.
Well, and the statement of how very French, when coming from an English person, I sort of always interpret as like a little too free, maybe a little too sexual.
Right. I really liked seeing this. Jane was so much more affectionate with Adele than in the previous version we saw. Like, I loved seeing her, like, holding her. It's like, because Jane can hold Adele in her lap and like read her stories and tell her about spooky like monsters. And it's super cute. But I loved that. And I thought it was really nice to see that kind of, I don't know, that closeness and Jane having someone to care for. And so I liked that a whole lot.
Yeah. And a couple other little things that I also have my cool section of like things that I would like to be said about me. Good company, except when in ill humor.
Yep.
Fair.
I love you until I don't.
I love you unless you're like not like kind of hungry and then or if a horse fell on you earlier. No, when I'm stressed about like what I'm wearing, like I think maybe I'm underdressed for a party, just make sure to remind me that I shouldn't worry because no one would notice. Just like really quick drive home that I'm unimportant. Mm-hmm. If you need me to like leave a room, and this is a thing that Rochester says to the women visiting his house, is return to your nest, little doves that you are. That's a cool thing to say to me. And then you were born to be my torment. That's like, if I'm really pissing you off, go ahead and say that one. And then I don't remember the context of this, should have written it down, but I also feel like you can say in any context to me, which is those words are unfeminine and untrue.
Yes. Oh my God, St. John, that jerk. I sent you a meme that I found on Pinterest, which we will surely share on our social at some point. And it's just St. John, and he's like, nah, you weren't made for love. Trust me, babe. And it's just like, oh, this savage jerk. Which one thing I thought was so fucking funny. Jane is trying to friend zone him so hard when he asks her the second time out on the moor by her house or her school to come with him to India. And she just keeps calling him brother, trying to be like, can you please pick up on this? That's how I see you. She's like, but you're my brother, but broski, hey. No, I don't want to marry you. Don't you get it, dude? Like, and he's like, no, you will be my wife and we'll maybe have love, but maybe not. Screw you. I suck.
And I think the voice on the wind, again, like similar to the laughter, much more subtle in this, but she seems crazy as she wanders away. I want to talk a little bit about the costumes, and then I want to hear what you think of the very ending. Cool. But I think the costumes were so well done in this. Yes. I think there's such a clear difference in what she's wearing when she's the governess versus when she's rich. Yes. And most specifically, and my mom and I did talk about this during the movie, the bonnet she wears at the end.
That's what I loved the best too.
Best bonnet I loved the bonnets in the last one. They were such character builders in the 83. This last bonnet blew every bonnet out of the water and was like the thing my mom said gets 100% credit to Lisa Cotter. She goes, at least she's spending her money well.
Yes, dude. No, I agree. And I love that that's what you picked up on too. I was like, damn, okay, I want that. I would wear it at any event that I could. It's so pretty. It says to me too that like Jane has taste and she has like good taste in fashion. She just didn't have the money to afford it before. So now that she's got some dough, she's like, okay, now I can finally be the influencer I was meant to be.
Yes. And the way that she comments on her dresses with like, she doesn't have the right kind of dresses for that throughout the movie. And then at the end, she's got a cool dress. And if you, the detailing on that dress matches the bonnet in a way that makes me go, yes, girl, yes, you did it. You got money and you're spending it right.
It's so good. I agree. So before we touch on the ending, one thing I just have to mention that I love that this version included that from what I hear is in the novel that they didn't do in the 83 version. So they have their passionate proposal scene underneath this tree. And then while they go into the house to go make out, then that night lightning hits the tree and splits it in half. That like happens in this movie. They come out the next day and you see the tree is cracked and the tree people, arborists are working on it. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, that's like the fiery passion of their love. That's the Gothic symbolism. They love each other so much that lightning splits this tree and rips it asunder. So I loved that.
That's so good.
That's where we find him sitting at the end with his dog
Yes.
Pilot, who, by the way, struck me as looking rather similar to Ruth.
Oh, that's nice. Very different coloring.
Different coloring, but the same kind of facial structure. Ruth
is my dog.
Lillian's dog.
For millions of listeners wondering, tell me about this other dog. Because everybody's here for the dog content.
Oh yeah.
I did note down a flaw of this film is that there's not a lot of Pilot.
Nope.
I could use some more Pilot. We hear him barking. And the horse scene, we only see him running after the horse in the distance.
Right.
We see Pilot a total of 3 times, but he is in the happily ever after moment, which is the most important part of a happily ever after moment. You have a dog.
Yes, a man with his dog. So if we can touch on that, I think that Timothy Dalton's blind and maimed Rochester looks way better than Fassbender's. He looks like a hobo. He's got this big scraggly beard. They also let him keep his hand, so he's able to cup her face from both sides.
Yeah, but that was pretty important, the one that made the kiss better.
That is nice. It is very nice. I mean, it is rather hilarious, I think, in the Dalton version when he like literally just holds up his stump and he's like, what about this? And she's like, I don't care, dude, whatever. So they let him keep a hand and he doesn't have a big gnarly scar. He just has like blind eye. But his beard was kind of maybe his disability.
Yes. I think the beard is more speaking to the fact that he sort of let himself go, because one of the things that I felt was really different in this that I think worked because of how they broke up the story, because so much of that distance between her leaving and him and her coming back, so much of that story is told at the front of the movie, that there's not a lot that happens between those moments. So we don't need to see them like, oh my God, they're still in love. Because of course they're still in love. Right. Because I'm not over it. So you're not over it. And so like, there's no need to kind of build that story back up again. And there's no way we would question for a second whether or not she's going to get back with him.
Right.
And so there's very little of that plot that happens between her finding out what happened and the fire. And Dame Judi Dench should be the only one allowed to tell that story because she did it so well. Then there's literally just her walking up to him at a tree.
Mm-hmm. It's the same tree that got struck by lightning because of the power of their love.
Yes.
Yay.
And the way that she takes his hand and then like, they barely say anything and then they kiss and the movie's over. And I'm not worried about them at all. Nice. I think they're very much in love and they're very happy. And great news, beards can be shaven off.
Yes, it can. But this movie does not lead us to believe that his eyesight can return, which other versions tell us happens. So he, as far as we know, watching this film with no other information, is blind forever. And that's great for them.
And if you lose it, if you keep your hand, your eyesight's gone forever. And that's the trade-off that we all know that Rochesters make at the beginning of their timeline.
It's true. It's true. You have to kind of pick that token at the beginning before you enter the game. So Lillian, we've just gone through the second version of this, of what is to hopefully be 50 or more versions that lie ahead of us. I think it's safe to assume that you liked this way better than the first one. Do you? Oh, I'm so glad that there's a version that could get you a little more excited about this. Any closing thoughts before we do our ratings?
Yeah, I think a big flaw was less Pilot. I've talked about that. I do think that the bonnet I will rate before I rate the overall show, 10 out of 10. No better bonnet. This is the bonnet to beat.
Agreed.
How about you?
We could see one better than that. I would say this is a great adaptation for a more modern audience, way easier to get hooked on these people, great performances. I thought it was very, very good. I liked it a whole lot. I still have a bias myself for the tall Welsh giant that is Timmy D, but this was pretty darn good. So if we want to jump into our ratings, I think so. Last time I used Timmy D's. So I meant to look up what I said for the last one. I think I said 5 or 6 out of 10. I think I'm going to give this one a 7.5 Timmy D's out of 10.
Whoa. You're still rating it out of Timmy D's? But I guess that's the only skill that matters to you.
That's my thing. That's just like going to be my basis. It doesn't mean he's not a part of this. This is just kind of my token of choice.
Okay. So I can't I also can't remember. I want to say it was a 5.
Yeah. And you used pilots last time.
Yes. And this time I'm rating on a new scale because I
Ooh.
don't think it's fair to rate this on pilots because he was so infrequently in the film. And so that would really bias the rating.
True.
I said 9 out of 10 bonnets.
Ooh, beautiful. Very nice.
And I really almost did a 10. But I think I was riding high on how low my expectations were going in because I was very concerned. and I think that there's an opportunity for it to even be better.
Oh, yes. Yeah. There is another BBC miniseries version. It's much shorter. And that, I think, technically is the best of the ones that I've seen thus far. Yeah. I think that one, when we watch it, it might get a 10 out of you, but, time will tell. But on that note, for those of you who are interested in the next version that we're going to watch and want to watch it with us, from what my research has told me, you can find this for free in a lot of services. But our next adaptation we will be watching is the 1997 movie version. The guy who plays Rochester, I can't think of the actor's name, but I know him from... He was in Game of Thrones. He played the dude who united all of the wildlings. Do you remember that guy's name, Lillian? You're a big
I'm looking him up right now.
Oh, I can't say that.
I know.
Syrian Hines.
Sure, that sounds right. Do that.
Syrian Hines. He played the guy who united all the wildlings. A big man, which I'm all for. A big thing for me visually with the story is just like, what does he look like and how much taller / broader is he than the woman he's in love with?
Yes, which matters so much.
And you need to have a big frame so you can completely envelop the woman that you love when you hold her in your arms and you're like, you're not leaving me. Damn it.
I think this is going to be the key difference between this and the previous versions is that you have not seen this. This is going to be your first watch of it.
Not seen this one.
But you did immediately say, as we were looking at the poster, he looks very grumpy. So we're anticipating a grumpy Rochester.
Very, very grumpy. He just looks mad. So that'll be hard to fall in love with a very grumpy man, but we will see. I, for one, am willing to give it a shot.
If people want to stalk us on the internet, Piper, how do they get in contact with us and how do they stalk us on the internet?
Oh my gosh. Well, we now have social media. Thank you to the social media queen that is Lillian, the co-host of this fabulous show. She has put all of her professional talents to use. She's created us a website. She has created us an Instagram, which is at AirBuds. She's created us a Twitter, which is at AirBuds. You can also email us, airbuds@gmail.com. So there's so many ways to engage, guys.
You can message us. You can find us everywhere. We are around. We are accessible via the internet.
It's so true. And we have such a backlog of memes and hysterical comments and posts to share with you all. So better follow because it's going to be a ride. I think that's all for now. We've done it, our second version, and time to go rest up before we once again dive into this madness with a very grumpy Rochester. Thank
everybody. You so much.
We'll see you later. Bye.